All right. Hello. My name is Stephen Pierce. I'm an English major and film studies minor at CNU. I'm a senior. This is my last semester. I'll be finishing up after this fall, and I'll be applying to graduate schools, programs, MFA programs for creative writing. I'll be applying to 5 or 6 programs, and hopefully we'll hear by late next spring if I got into any. So, yeah. I was a summer scholar this past summer, and I'll be presenting on what I researched, what I worked on, and who I worked with, which was Dr. Jessica Apolloni, who is an assistant professor in the English department at CNU. So the presentation is titled Summer Scholars 2020, Poison, Courts, and Revenge Tragedies in the Elizabethan Era by Stephen R. Pierce. My middle name is Robert. Now, my duties as an English summer scholar were to research and analyze, read and take notes, discuss and communicate. Since Summer Scholars 2020 was inevitably going on amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, we studied and worked from home. I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to work in a safe environment with a good boss, as well as meeting weekly online with other summer scholars to see how their independent studies were going. I didn't have any issues at all this summer, and found the online Summer Scholars program to be quite fun and rewarding. I researched a lot of sources, I took a lot of notes, and me and Dr. Apolloni met weekly, sometimes daily, to discuss what she was working on, the research that I was working on, the notes I took, topics like those. Now, for being a summer scholar with Dr. Apolloni, there was 2 major projects that I got to work on. The first was a scholarly article or scholarly essay titled Playing with Poison, Motive, Murder, and Legal Uncertainty in Early Modern English Drama. This essay will be coming out later this fall, and I will be listed in the publication, I believe as a research assistant, something like that. So I'll get I'll be a source. I'll get the certification, whatever it is. Now, the book that she's writing that's due next year in 2021, I didn't work on with her as much as the essay because the essay comes out this year and is soon. So the book is titled Violent Ends, Shakespeare and Comparative Law. Obviously, both of these are written by Dr. Jessica Apolloni, and I was a summer scholar. So yeah. Now, quick summary of my research or my job before I dive too deep in. My research this summer focused on the true poison plots that writers from the late 1500s and early 1600s wrote into their dramas. In plays like Shakespeare's Hamlet or Marston's Antonio's Revenge, poison plots are at the center of the drama. The authors from those times were influenced by Roman legends, Renaissance stories, and even true trials, like the death of Thomas Overbury, a poet and essayist who was poisoned to death in the early 1600s. By looking at these poison plots and poison trials, I also researched the revenge tragedies that were mentioned earlier. The motives behind revenge and the poison plots and how the characters enact that revenge is how the justice system at the time judged those crimes. By looking at the fictional plots that were based on real crimes and trials, these authors would comment on the legal system in places like England and Italy in their time period. Early on in the summer, well actually, before the summer, I met with Dr. Apolloni a couple times in March or February because she had taught me a couple times and we had done everything we needed to do to make sure I'd be a summer scholar. But unfortunately, COVID-19 had shut down campus, so we talked a few times over email before Summer Scholar started, just so I would know what I was getting into and what my work would be this summer. Beginning in the summer, early June, I believe it might have been actually June 1st, I was tasked with becoming familiar with many of the European revenge dramas from the late 1500s and early 1600s. These dramas included Hamlet, Antonio's Revenge, Titus Andronicus, the Spanish Tragedy, the Revenger's Tragedy, and more. For our research, Hamlet and Antonio's Revenge were the 2 most vital, since they are the most famous poison plot dramas from their respective time period. The topic of poison, morality, and criminal investigations were at the center of what Dr. Apolloni was interested in for her paper and part of her book. For the paper, Hamlet ended up taking most of the academic spotlight, since it is well-sourced and the most famous poison plot drama from the time period. I'll mention this a little bit later, the reasons why Hamlet was the main part of the scholarly essay, but a majority of it is because, like I said, it's the most famous, one of the most famous plays ever, one of the most famous Shakespeare plays, and it is a poison plot and a revenge tragedy, which are the two main topics that Dr. Apolloni is interested in for her research. Early on, after becoming acquainted with the text of the time, I was tasked with reading scholarly essays and articles on many topics to help with the research for Dr. Apolloni. As I read these works, I would take vivid notes of anything I found of importance to share. I added comments to my notes to make sure my work for Dr. Apolloni was as clear and helpful as possible. Topics of these articles and essays included Senecan dramas, Seneca influences on those dramas that came out in 1500s and 1600s, the Inns of Court, crime in Elizabethan England, poison trials in Europe during the late 1500s and early 1600s, common laws in those time periods, poison on the stage, revenge dramas, and Roman texts. The notes I took on these topics were valuable in shaping how Dr. Apolloni would write her scholarly paper in a little bit of the book. Now, all those topics, they may seem like a lot, but that's, months of research and notes that I did. I got to read a lot of cool sources, take a lot of notes. I took a lot of notes and would communicate weekly on the important stuff from the notes, stuff that research and information that Dr. Apolloni would need for her paper and a little bit for the book. Now, another aspect of my research in Summer Scholars was to find valuable sources and scholars for me and Dr. Apolloni to read on and research for the projects. It was important to make sure the sources were accurate, informative, and reliable for any work that Dr. Apolloni would end up using them for. Now, a lot of times, I've learned through the English department, if it's an old source, it's either accurate or not accurate at all. So part of my job is to make sure what we were finding was accurate. Just because I found one source saying one thing doesn't mean she can use that as the basis of her paper. I will say most of the sources and research that I found this summer in Summer Scholars, I found in multiple different essays and multiple different sources. I had to find the information more than once, because this is a scholarly essay. One example was finding sources for the origins or background of Shakespeare's play Titus Andronicus. This was important for Dr. Apolloni because many Shakespeare plays were based off of historical events/people. We found out the main sourcing of Titus Andronicus was a mixture of Senecan dramas, medieval stories, and classical myths. This wasn't a play like Hamlet or Henry IV, those plays that were, or Richard III, those plays that were based off real people. Obviously, they're fiction, but those are historical plays. And Titus Andronicus, we learned, was based off of more dramas that Shakespeare was influenced by. Later in the summer, as we both got farther into the Summer Scholar schedule, the work became easier, more creative, and much more rewarding, at least for my part. For most of the first month, I was tasked with taking plentiful amounts of notes, but in the second half, my scholarly opinion helped shape the research and writings of Dr. Apolloni. In fact, the later part of the Summer Scholars program, mid-July, so about 6 weeks in, most of the notes I was taking for Dr. Apolloni involved law and literature as she shifted more to the writing mode. We succeeded in finding juicy scholarship, research, and sources on dramatic items like poison plots and revenge tragedies. So it was important to conclude the program with the bones of the paper, law and literature. The topic of law and literature is actually a class that I took with Dr. Apolloni, so that was another background that we had that helped with the research for both of us for her paper. The final weeks of the program involved Dr. Apolloni working on drafts of her paper as well as research for her book. As she wrote, I researched. When she was done writing for a certain topic, I read it, revised it, and helped make sure all of our work from the summer was finding little spots in her writing to shine. Obviously, she was the one writing it. I'm not taking any credit for that, but I wanted to make sure, and she wanted to make sure that we both were working together, and the sources that I worked on was going to make sure that they were part of her writing. The final notes that I took for Summer Scholars had to do with the topic of law and literature, like I mentioned before. We mainly looked at how criminal investigations, revenge, and the justice system have been portrayed through years of literature. Obviously, for Dr. Apolloni's work, the main time period we were interested in was the late 1500s and early 1600s. We found plenty of sources of drama with plots of revenge to seek justice for a crime. The legal system was not looked at in a competent way by many citizens, which led to it being mocked or ridiculed in some dramas. Now, obviously, with poison plots in that time period, you had to have circumstantial evidence, as I'll point out on this slide as well. So when you had a poison plot and a poison drama, that's why so many of them ended up being revenge stories, because there really was no evidence of poison or who poisoned them. So since the paper that Dr. Apollonia was working on isn't due until the fall, and Summer Scholars ended in early August, I've included the main topics of the final version of the draft that we worked on in the summer. Some of this might have changed because her paper, she was working on it after Summer Scholars ended, but this is what I worked on with her. The introduction was about how poison plots on the English stage traumatized tensions within their staged investigations of murder by poison. The first section was called Comparative Legal Influences in Revenge Plots, the history of certain legal issues and how they connect to the dramas. The next section was Poison and the Problem of Proof, how secretive poisoning was back in the 1500s and 1600s. And I'll talk for a second on the poisoning and the problem of proof. That was a very interesting thing to read upon for actual poison plots, because the only way you can get somebody is if people confess, or if there's circumstantial evidence of somebody seeing it happen. Obviously, they didn't have DNA testing, anything like that. So finding that information in plays and it actually happening in real life back then was probably the most interesting part of Summer Scholars for me, and very rewarding. The next part was intertextual inquiries of visual evidence, how many different versions there can be of evidence in a crime, and changeable appearance and inaccessible evidence, another section on what I just talked about. The problem of appearance, disguises, and lack of solid evidence in the crimes. Concluding Summer Scholars, these main topics covers much of the research we worked on this summer to write about Hamlet, poison plots, law and literature, and the issue of evidence back in the early 1600s. The 2020 Summer Scholars program was an incredibly rewarding for me to be a part of. I not only got to work with a great professor in my department, I got to see all the interesting and important research that other students my age did across CNU. I'm eternally grateful for the opportunity and will hopefully take on all the wisdom, lessons, and experience from Summer Scholars to a graduate school in 2021. Again, my name is Stephen Pierce, and thanks for watching.